I want to welcome everybody to Radical Jewish Politics, and it's wonderful to see not only such a large crowd, but also a crowd that's really a cross-section of the community. And this is the second installment in an annual series, the Night at the Museum, UCSC Night at the Museum, which is one of the ways in which we, the IHR, Institute for Humanities Research, I should have said that I'm the director of that first. And I also should have said my name, which is Nathaniel Deutsch, director of the Institute for Humanities Research and the Center for Jewish Studies. But I was so excited to welcome you that I started with you rather than with me. But among the things we do at the IHR is bring events like this to the community, to Santa Cruz, and even more broadly. And we think that especially as a public university, and especially at a time like this, that it's particularly important to do that. And we know sometimes it can be difficult to get up to campus, so why not bring campus here and have an event here at the MA. We also have another series, Questions That Matter, at Kumba Jazz Center that some of you may have participated in. So I want to welcome all of you. I want to thank a few people before introducing our speakers. First of all, the staff of the IHR, Irena Polic, who's the managing director of the IHR, who has played such a big role in making this happen. She is the staff of the year at UC Santa Cruz. So congratulations to Irena. Evan Guy and Jessica Guild, who are both here, played really key roles. We also have an amazing group of students that work at the IHR, Corina, who's somewhere here, Andrea, and Genesis, and I want to thank them. I also want to thank Kim Farrell, who made the poster. So hopefully a lot of you saw the poster and appreciated it, so thank you to her. And I want to thank Juan, the sound person, and John, the video person here. They've worked with us a lot, and they're doing a great job. So now to introduce the speakers for today's event. First of all, I want to introduce Professor Alma Hickman, who's a professor of history at the university, and actually just today was officially notified that she will be the new Neufeld-Levin Endowed Chair in Holocaust Studies, which is wonderful. I'm embarrassing a lot of people. I'm sorry, I've got to do that. And Professor Hickman is, among her superpowers, she works in Ladino, Arabic, Hebrew, French sources, and is an expert on North African Jewish history and Moroccan Jewish history in particular. And her appointment to the Holocaust Chair is significant for a variety of reasons, but also because she is a scholar, among other things, in the impact of the Holocaust on Sephardi Jews, which was terrible impact, but also on how the Holocaust and policies that were associated with it impacted Jewish communities in North Africa, which is a very understudied field. So it's wonderful that she's been appointed to that position. Her book in progress is called Radical Nationalist Moroccan Jewish Politics, 1925 to 1975. And I'm sure that's going to be a wonderful book once it's published. The speaker today is Toni Michaels, who's a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a graduate of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and we're very proud of that. He's also a surfer. He's been surfing here for 40 years. And so he can combine expertise in surfing and Jewish leftist politics. It's a rare combination. He's the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York, which won at least one major award. He's also the editor of Jewish Radicals, a documentary history, and he's currently finishing a book on the impact of the Russian Revolution in the United States. So I look forward to that as well. Now, one of the things we really want to do tonight is hear from you. So there will be cards that are handed out, and you can write questions, and Professor Hickman, who's going to be leading the question and answer after Professor Michaels speaks, will be reading questions from the cards. So you'll have an opportunity to participate that way. So without further ado, Professor Toni Michaels.
Nathaniel, thank you for that generous introduction, and I want to thank Nathaniel and his staff at the Institute for this invitation. They've been incredibly hospitable, and also to Alma Hickman of the History Department and Jewish Studies for making this possible and being a wonderful interlocutor since I've been here. It's really an honor to be part of this esteemed series, and it's especially gratifying for me as an alum, as Nathaniel mentioned, to be back in Santa Cruz. Actually, I come several times a year, but not in a respectable capacity. Being here got me thinking about some of the courses I took. And one of the first courses about Jews I took, there was no Jewish Studies program here at the time, but I took Professor Murray Baumgarten's and co-taught with Peter Kenez's History of the Holocaust, but it was actually much more than that because it was my first taste of Yiddish literature and a number of other aspects of European history. And one of the last, I think it must have been one of the very last courses I took, my spring semester, was a graduate seminar on the Bolshevik Revolution with Peter Kenez, and I still have those books, some of those books, including the first one I read in your course. It was Alexander Rabinovich's The Bolsheviks Come to Power. It was the first book on the syllabus. I still use it, and I remembered, Professor Kenez won't remember this, but we had to write a 20-page paper. I'd never written anything so long before, and I chose to write on Lenin and the Jewish question, which I hope does not exist anymore. But I went to talk to you about it. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to write 20 pages. And your answer was, at 20 pages, I'm just getting started. Meaning 20 pages is nothing. But I went to graduate school. I did not specialize in Russian history, but it's always been an abiding interest in mine, more than an interest, something of an obsession. The revolution in particular. I'm a U.S. historian, but it's always been since the graduate seminar. It's been part of my interest. It seems too mild a word, but that's what it is. And so I'm finishing a book on the Russian Revolution, and particularly its impact on the United States and Jews especially. And some of my comments today are about that. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, of course. I've read that Vladimir Putin is not marking it in Russia, but that shouldn't stop us here in Santa Cruz from talking about it. And so that's what I'll do in 30 minutes. The revolution can be considered one of the most expansive touchstones in American political and intellectual history, in my opinion. Meaning that most Americans over a roughly 6-decade period define themselves politically in some way or another in reference to it. Now, most Americans didn't like it. Most Americans are hostile to it. But even so, there was always a good number of Americans, starting at the very beginning, trade unionists, teachers, feminists, Pan-Africanists, others, who saw the revolution as a vast and daring experiment in reconstructing social relations at all levels. Jews especially, out of all Americans, were especially interested in it. They felt strongly invested in it, probably more so than any other group. They wanted a positive, successful outcome to the revolution, whatever that meant. And there were various reasons, good reasons for that. One was pretty simple, that of the 2.5 million immigrants that came to the United States between the late 19th century and in the 1920s, in that period, 40 to 50 years, the vast majority of them came from the Russian Empire. So they had family there, they had townspeople there, they had connections to Russia, and so what happened there always affected them in a very immediate way. It affected their neighbors, their former neighbors, their relatives, their parents, and so forth. So there was this connection, but there was more to that. There was the fact that the Bolsheviks seemed to be realizing the dream of building a socialist society, a classless society, which many of the immigrants wanted. Socialists, as of 1917, Jews had embraced socialism in America, especially in New York City and Chicago, like never before. This was really a mass movement among the Jews. They had elected in 1917, just around the time of the revolution, something like 18 Socialist Party city councilmen. So for them, when the revolution broke out, everything seemed to be coming together. There was socialism on the march where they lived in the United States, and there was a revolution in Eastern Europe, and they were excited, they were enchanted by that possibility. And in fact, more than that, Jews had been in the United States actively supporting the revolutionary movement for decades by the time this happened. They sent money, they gave money for weapons that revolutionaries used. They sent Yiddish magazines and newspapers. All in these and other ways, they were really active in helping the revolution. In 1917 seemed like the decisive moment. But there was more than that. The Red Army was the protector of Jews during the horrible civil war in which probably over 100,000 Jews were slaughtered. And so there was this recognition that that there was no, even among those Jews who were not socialists, even among non-political Jews, even among conservative Jews, as few as there were at that time, that the only thing that really stood between the survival of the Jewish people and death was the Red Army. There was the hope, and to some degree really the reality that Jewish communal life was being reconstructed in the early years of the revolution under the leadership of the Soviet Union. Jews had national rights in the Soviet Union. There was a Yiddish culture that was built under state tutelage. The complexities of this I don't need to go into right now. I will say there was a tremendous amount of disillusionment with the revolution that happened in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and then again in the 1940s. And then again in the 1950s among successive generations of socialists. But I'm just talking about the early years of the revolution and what that meant for Jews in the United States as they looked upon a horrible situation of war and counter-revolution and saw the Soviet government as not just an alternative, but something of a savior to the Jews. And also not just saving the Jews, but doing it in the context of building socialism. The most immediate ramification of this enthusiasm that I'm trying to describe and evoke in the years after 1917, the most immediate concrete political result was an embrace by many Jews of the American Communist Party. A direct result of the revolution was the creation of a party, the Communist Party, that saw as its purpose the reenactment, if you will, of the Bolshevik Revolution on American soil. And many Jews flocked to the party, either as members or, in fact, more likely as supporters, as activists in the realm of the Communist Party. And this included people who were not necessarily communists. These were people who had different political outlooks. Sometimes Zionists were part of the communist movement. People who saw themselves as just sort of vaguely radical, but not, Leninists or anything like that. It was a mass movement, and a lot of Jews joined it. And for the next 30 years, Jews were they're the main constituency of the Communist Party, much to the discomfiture of the Communist Party and Jewish communal leaders, for that matter. They were not always pleased by this. More than a majority of the Communist Party in New York in the 30s and 40s were Jews. It's not supposed to be a party of the Jews. It was supposed to be a party of the proletariat. But for reasons, some of the reasons I'm touching on, the Communist Party proved an attractive political home, not just for Jewish immigrants, but also their children in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So this was an important event, the Russian Revolution. It altered the political configuration of American Jews. And it did it first and foremost in the emergence of this party, this avowedly revolutionary party in the 1920s that not only supported the revolution in Russia, but wanted to carry out a revolution in the United States. You can imagine what a risky move this was. in the 1920s. 1920s was a conservative decade. And here was a significant number of Jews, especially in the big cities, doing probably the dumbest thing you could do if your goal was to fit in to American society. That wasn't the route to do it. Was through the Communist Party. And sure enough, there was the 1920s, late teens and 20s witnessed a new phenomenon in American life, which is a virulent form of conspiratorial anti-Semitism that viewed the Russian Revolution as a conspiracy masterminded by Jews in connection with the help of New York Jews. And so if you were around at the time, you would hear these accusations by people like the Attorney General of the United States, prominent religious figures. The great industrialist Henry Ford spoke openly and frequently about what was sometimes called a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, in which, again, New Yorkers from the Lower East Side were said to be going to Moscow and Petrograd and so forth in droves to carry out a communist revolution in conjunction with Russian Jews there. This was not beyond the pale to say these things in American life. People said it in Senate testimonies. They said it in the popular press and so forth. So there was really, there were really some consequences in these political decisions that a large segment of Jews, and again, not just communists, but other Jews on the left who wanted to see a successful outcome to the revolution for both reasons having to do with politics, their socialism, and having to do with their Jewishness, for the reasons I explained. It seemed that Jews had, as I say, a really life or death stake in the outcome of the revolution. The person who symbolized the revolution the most, more so than Vladimir Lenin himself, was Leon Trotsky, for a few reasons. Trotsky lived in New York for 10 weeks in January 1917, just before the first phase of the revolution broke out, resulting in the overthrow of the Tsar in February 1917, and he was something of a celebrity in New York City. He was a great public speaker, and he gave lectures all the time. And most of the people who flocked to his lectures were Jews because many knew Russian or German. He spoke German. He didn't know Yiddish, but which was ironic because he reached his largest audience through the Yiddish press. His articles were commissioned and translated into Yiddish. And so here was this figure. Not many people knew who he was in early 1917. He was yet one more Russian Jewish revolutionary to come to New York. That was common. They came all the time to New York. So here was one. He was especially talented as a speaker. And then the revolution breaks out, and he goes back. And a few months later, it's not just Leon Trotsky, the guy who stood on a soapbox in Central Park. It was Leon Trotsky, the first Soviet foreign minister, and then Leon Trotsky, the head of the Red Army. Right? So from an American Jewish perspective, this is amazing, that a Jew could rise to the heights of power in the new Russia was remarkable. Now, on the other side, the right-wing anti-Semitic side, Trotsky was also a symbol of the revolution. It was a symbol of how Jewish it was as they viewed it, how destructive it was. They understood, they saw a reality that was the same as the reality Jews saw, which is to say that something profound had happened in Russia. It had implications for Jews. It opened the doors for Jews to attain levels of power and responsibility that they could have never attained before. And the anti-Semites said, this is why it's terrible. It's the symbol of why it's terrible, the revolution. And a good number of Jews looked at the very same picture and said, this is why this is marvelous. Trotsky. Right? Trotsky, this is the guy who we saw in the cafes a few months ago. Right? Now he's commanding a Red Army, and it's the Red Army that rescues so many Jews from death. So Trotsky becomes this symbol that's talked about in the press all the time. When people denounce the Bolshevik Revolution, they name Lenin and Trotsky over and over again, sometimes Trotsky more than Lenin, because, again, he's a Jew, as the symbol of what's going on there, good or bad. Now, Trotsky himself, well, what I'm suggesting is that in the eyes of Jews, Trotsky was something of a Jewish hero. And he was a Jewish hero not only because of his Jewish background, but he was seen as a hero for exhibiting qualities that were said to be Jewish. Yes, he was a Russian by cultural attainment, but so many Jews saw him. He was a Jew because some essential characteristics made him a Jew. Some people said he was a Jew because of his fervid intellectuality. That's Jewish. His passion was Jewish, they said in the press. His passion for social justice, some commentators said, is Jewish. And my favorite one, which I'm going to read to you because I can't paraphrase it and do justice to it. This is what one journalist wrote, quote, Leon Trotsky is a universalist in his revolutionary aspirations because he is the incarnation of the wrath, anger, and bitterness of a race tortured since the destruction of the ancient Roman Empire, end of quote. So his Jewishness, according to this Jewish journalist writing in a Jewish magazine, his Jewishness is the entirety of Jewish suffering and history poured out in a revolutionary fervor. And it's his Jewishness that is both yearning for something better and anger towards the Gentile world. That's implicit in the quote, at least. Now, again, this is fodder for the anti-Semites. I mean, in a sense, this is what they're saying, right? But nonetheless, this journalist didn't care. This is how he viewed Trotsky, as the embodiment of the Jewish people. So if Trotsky says, as he did, I'm not a Jew, for that matter, he said, I'm not a Russian. I am a social democrat, he once said. I'm a social democrat, meaning a Marxist revolutionary. I'm a social democrat, and that's it. So Trotsky didn't want to see himself as a Jew. He knew what his background was, and he knew that he lived in Russia and spoke Russian. What he was saying is these inherited identities of Jewishness and Russian mean nothing to me as a revolutionary. I am a revolutionary. And some Jews were saying, yeah, but your very revolutionariness is what makes you a Jew. Don't you see, Trotsky? So these differences of perception and self-perception, Trotsky's self-perception is standing above nation or ethnicity or religion, made him, to use the term of his biographer and political follower, a Polish Jew named Isaac Deutscher, he was a non-Jewish Jew. Right? That was the category he set up for people like like Trotsky, or Karl Marx, as you saw on the poster, or Rosa Luxemburg. Right? That category of Jews by background, but who have transcended their Jewishness through a revolutionary universalism, was how Trotsky saw himself. Right? And that type, for a long time, defined the Jewish encounter with socialism. Right? Socialism mandated it, starting more or less with Karl Marx in the mid-19th century. The idea, the norm in socialism was, socialism's universal, it's above nationality, nationality's obsolete, and Jews, who are Jews, after all in the 19th century, they were thought as a remnant of a previous medieval past that existed because of persecution against them, or maybe because of their function that they played within the medieval economy. And they would disappear, and this is not a bad thing, it's a good thing that they disappear. It's a progressive thing, it's a forward-looking thing, and many socialists, Trotsky being one of them, agreed with that. That was one type, that's the original type, if you will, of the revolutionary Jew. And then a second type arose, echoed by the kinds of comments I was conveying to you by Jews and their perceptions of Trotsky as a Jew. And this type was someone who was both an affirmative Jew, someone who affirmed Jewish identity, and revolutionary universalism. And that type came into existence around 1900 in response to a reality Trotsky was slow to pick up on. And that is violence against Jews in the Russian Empire and beyond, pogroms and so forth, that were becoming more common, more widespread, and more deadly from the late 19th century into World War I and beyond, and ultimately, of course, culminating in the Holocaust. And so in response to that reality, which is to say the reality of both class oppression that many Jews faced, and the reality of violent anti-Semitism that was becoming more apparent, there was there were efforts, organized efforts, that resulted in political parties to say there has to be some way of combining a national, which is to say a Jewish group affirmation, with revolutionary socialism. And much of Jewish political history in the first half of the 20th century was built around efforts to synthesize those two impulses, right? The socialist and the Jewish nationalist, the Jewish group solidarity with class solidarity. Very difficult undertaking theoretically, very difficult politically to carry out, but nonetheless, that was where much of Jewish politics went in the first half of the 20th century, so that I would suggest much of modern Jewish political history is built around those two positions, right? The Jewish leftist as internationalist, and that's it, and the Jewish leftist as a Jewish leftist, which is to say a Jew who believes in both solidarity with other Jews and internationalism in perpetuity, or however long it would take for Jews to liberate themselves, according to this perspective. Now, these two categories, as I say, I think structure most of Jewish politics in the modern period. But they were never evenly balanced, they were never discrete, and they were never stable, right? Which is to say, there were internal fissures, constant debates. What the terms of the discussion were shifted over time, this direction or that direction. And finally, people within those categories crossed boundaries. Zionists became anti-Zionists. Internationalists became Jewish nationalists. Right? These things happened. And even Leon Trotsky, in the final years leading up to his death, modified his views in the face of Hitler. He said Jews were going to survive for a long time, or they certainly should if they want to. He talked about the possibility of a Jewish homeland, not through Zionism, which he viewed his whole life as reactionary, but maybe in some future confederation of socialist states there could be a Jewish homeland in that. And these are modifications that were significant. They're indicative of how positions could change one way or the other over time. So I don't mean to suggest anything static. I'm only saying that I think a useful way of understanding modern Jewish politics is to understand the interplay and the interplay of those two impulses which are contained within the radical experience. I'd go even a step further and say that probably for most minority groups of whatever kind are subjected to these claims, the claims of universalism, you must be part of some larger community of human belonging beyond your group, and the claims of community. Right? I think this is endemic to being a minority in the modern period. It's a side thought, but I don't. It's only to say that I don't think Jews are unique in this way. I think Jews are probably typical in having to navigate the claims of the universal and the particular on them, although I think maybe what's unusual about Jews is the strong attraction to socialism and revolutionary politics over a long period of time across geographic boundaries. I believe that if not unique, then it's unusual. Maybe we can possibly talk about that afterwards. Now, back to the revolution. I mentioned before that the revolution caused incredible outpouring of enchantment, excitement, and so forth. And I also mentioned it was the source of very painful disillusionment over the decades. Looking back on a century, it seems to me there are two basic questions to ask, which is, should we see the revolution as an inspiring example of possibility, right, of human beings, the ability of human beings to fundamentally remake their social reality? Or is it a warning against the dangers of grand schemes of social transformation? Right? To me, those are two central questions of what I see the legacy of the revolution. And they might be academic questions or only questions that socialists ask themselves when we're together. But I think the questions assumed a renewed relevance in just the last year or so. And that owes to the fact that a self-avowed socialist, Bernie Sanders, ran for president. So that what seemed to be remote, distant historical questions, I think as I said, reasserted themselves. At the same time, Bernie Sanders' Jewishness didn't go unnoticed, because here's the first time a Jew has let me flip it around. This is the first time a socialist has made a credible bid for the presidency since 1932, when Norman Thomas ran on the Socialist Party ticket and won about 1 million votes. Norman Thomas was not Jewish. He was, for a while, I believe, a Presbyterian minister. But Bernie Sanders is Jewish. And one of the questions asked about him all the time was, what does this mean that he's Jewish? What kind of Jew is he? What's his Jewish identity? Does he practice Judaism? What are his attitudes towards Israel? What are those? And these questions were asked, of course, and I think appropriately, about him. But what's for me most interesting was how he fit into Jewish history. And so when I look at Sanders' biography, he's typical, regardless of how he feels about his Jewishness. And I don't quite know. It seems, well, it doesn't matter. What's interesting is where he fits into the larger history that I've sketched out. His father came to the United States from Poland in the early 1920s. In the aftermath of the destruction and cataclysmic events, I started off by talking. And he's part of he was part of that last final wave of immigrants just after the revolution that were let into the country before the Congress shut down immigration from Europe. He barely got in. The Sanders family, in fact, we know many people in the Sanders family did perish in the Holocaust, and that certainly would have, all likelihood would have been true of his father too. So he's part of this final wave, and a final wave that was quite radical. This was the most radical wave of Jewish immigrants that had come to the United States. I don't know about his father and what his political views are. I don't think that's known. But he comes out of that post-war immigrant, post-revolutionary wave. Sanders himself grew up in Brooklyn, and if you grew up in Brooklyn when he did in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it meant that you absorbed certain ideas, which was at the minimum that organized labor should act on its own behalf to pursue the interests of the working class. However, that principle was articulated through social democracy or more radical socialism or communism or New Deal liberalism. That was part of the atmosphere of Jewish Brooklyn, most of Jewish Brooklyn during that period. He evidently absorbed that himself. He became a political activist on the Lower East Side, and what could be more appropriate for a Jewish future socialist activist than to come of age canvassing tenants on the Lower East Side, as he did with his brother, to fight a proposed development scheme on the Lower East Side. He joined the Young People's Socialist League in Chicago as a student at the University of Chicago, an organization, this is the youth organization of the Socialist Party that dated way back to 1907, went through a Trotskyist phase, so there's a tie-in with Leon Trotsky again, and it was a small group, but it was a highly active one and mostly Jewish, accidentally. It was not nominally Jewish, but if you were a young New York Jew with intellectual proclivities, why not join the Young People's Socialist League? That's a perfectly understandable choice to do in the early 1960s. This was a kind of anti-Soviet socialist group, but also quite radical, quite far to the left in its time. And then he runs for Congress, runs for mayor. He wins, he runs for Congress, then Senate, and if by some, almost as if entering into the realm of science fiction, he makes it through the Reagan era, still as a socialist, and then makes a bid for president that went farther than any self-described socialist ever had. Now, future historians are going to have to puzzle this through. How in the world did this happen? It's easier to explain how it was that a Jew wound up running for president as a socialist. I just made some attempt to do that. But how a socialist got as far as he did in the 21st century, we'll have to talk about in some point down the line and try to figure this out. But I just say, by way of conclusion, just as a final remark, because we're at time, I just say that regardless of the outcome of the last election or future elections, what may be most important about Bernie Sanders is that he restored the ideal of socialism, whatever that might mean in the 21st century, to the center of public discussion again. And I think that's the real lasting legacy we have that I can see at this point. So thank you for listening.
So I'll make my remarks very, very brief so that we can get to your questions as soon as possible, and maybe you can take this time to start thinking about what you want to ask Toni, thoughts that have come to mind while he was speaking. So you all should have cards and some pencils that have circled around. So those will be collected in the coming few minutes, and we'll start discussing those. But before transitioning to that question, I wanted to raise back this idea of Isaac Deutscher and the non-Jewish Jew category and expand what Toni was talking about to a broader scale. Not only what about Jewish radicals in the United States, what is this long history, but a broader, more global perspective on this as well. How can we contextualize and connect the Yiddish-speaking socialists of New York City to, say, the Farsi-speaking socialists in Iran, or the Arabic-speaking socialists and communists in Iraq or in Egypt, as well as in Morocco, where I work? What, if anything, are the connective points that we can draw between a phenomenon across the 20th century where we see so many Jews in so many disparate locations being drawn to a set of universalist political options, albeit at different times and for different reasons, and yet there might be something there to explore. And my second major point would be, what about the relationship of these sorts of radical Jewish politics with other isms of the 20th century? Zionism, for example, other local iterations of nationalisms, fascism even. And this brings me back to another Jewish socialist prime minister in France, in fact, who did win a successful bid for the presidency, Léon Blum, who was the very first Jew and first socialist to become president of France, and it didn't last for, or prime minister rather, and it didn't last for very long. But this was at this supreme high point in French politics, with this high point of socialism at this very heightened level, elite political level, in the midst of a Spanish Civil War that in and of itself was a battle between socialisms in one sense, Spanish republicanism, against a global threat of fascism, a sort of antechamber to the Second World War. And then, of course, Hitler himself had just become chancellor just a few years prior to each of these events. So what are these high tides of populism linked within which we see socialism responding? And I wonder if there's some sort of connection to draw between this current political moment and what Toni has been describing in a broader global political context as well. So if you have your questions, gathering them, we can start transitioning to that Q&A. If you have a card, hold it up.
I stayed within time. Did I stay within time?
Yeah. I don't know if anybody has seen Between Two Ferns, the comedy show, but this is what this setup kind of reminds me of. We just need like a fern plant with some red berries, hopefully. Thank you.
Oh my God.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope you all have good handwriting. I'll do my best. Okay, Toni mentioned Rosa Luxemburg. What was her role in radical Jewish politics?
Depends how you define Jewish. She had nothing to do with the Jewish parties, which is the parties that defined themselves as Jewish parties, meaning the constituency was meant to be Yiddish-speaking Jewish workers or non-workers, Yiddish-speaking Jews, parties for them to represent specific Jewish interests, and she wanted nothing to do with them. She, like Trotsky, was staunchly internationalist. She opposed independence for Poland, for instance. Many other revolutionary Marxists wanted that, but she'd have no truck with any kind of nationalism, anything she saw as separatism. So she was a burning example of the Jew as revolutionary internationalist.
We have a lot of really good questions. I'll pick one from the middle. How has the recent election affected anti-Semitism in the US, and how that might relate to what you've been discussing?
Well, I've been pretty surprised. I mean, I don't consider myself naive, certainly not indifferent to anti-Semitism. But I've been surprised by the extent to which it's been stirred up by by the Trump campaign. Of course, compared to the anti-Latino sentiment, for instance, or anti-Muslim sentiment, I think it's much milder than that. But nonetheless, it's clearly present. I spent some time reading Breitbart News, and you should.
And you're still alive.
That's right. I live to tell about it, and I read some very surprising things, especially in the readers' comments, but in some of the articles as well. So I think there's been a resurgence. I think a lot of it is very traditional, kind of old-fashioned anti-Semitism. I think the term alt-right should not be used, actually, because I think it masks what the reality is. We're talking about a traditional, far-right, often racist anti-Semitism that is familiar. I don't think there's anything new about it in its content from what I can see. And I think what's new is, once again, it's been mobilized. And I think by a national figure. I think the last time that happened, actually, I'd say it was Reagan. Not in the same way that Trump did. In other words, I don't think there's anyone in the upper echelons of the Reagan administration who hated Jews, but in the wake of his election, there was a resurgence of neo-Nazism and white supremacy that was violent and resulted in violent attacks and in at least one case, a death of a Jew. So I think this is some return to that, but I think the situation's worse, actually. Yeah. I think it's worse because the Republican Party has moved to the extreme. So I think we have a problem. I think the problem is bigger than Jews, but Jews are certainly part and parcel of it. It would be a mistake to overlook anti-Semitism of the right-wing variety at this current moment. And I'm not sanguine. I'm not predicting doom. I'm just saying this may be more than a simple pendulum. What we're seeing in Trump may be more serious than a pendulum swing to the right and then back again. I think it could be worse than that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can interject my own question among the questions, but we have several prominent Jews, in fact, in Trump's cabinet, right? We have Jared Kushner, who's supposedly going to be the man to fix the Middle East, despite the fact his father paid for him to go to Harvard, and as far as I can tell, has only bamboozled people out of property for most of his life. In which case, I don't know. But, so, I mean, what do you make of that, right? The fact that we not only have issues of anti-Semitism, perhaps, that have sort of crept out, but it's a little bit more complicated even than that. We have Trump's one of his primary advisors, or at least fall boys, in this kind of position.
Well, this is a kind of a curious thing, at least in American politics, to see a number of Jews, a number of them are devout, they're Orthodox Jews in some way, find a comfortable home so far in the Trump administration. I think it reflects a swing to the right in the American Orthodox community. In the last several decades, I think it's been building, and I think this has come out strongly. Now, most American Jews have not changed much in their political loyalties. It's actually quite remarkable that an election after election, at least presidential election, 75% of Jews continue to vote Democratic. So there's continuity in that way. But among Jews who are Republican, and especially I'm thinking of the Orthodox Jews, not that Orthodoxy is a monolith, it's not. So what I'm saying may not apply to all Orthodox Jews, but I think there has been a swing to the right. They're simply not bothered by what they see in Trump for probably a host of reasons. I would say, though, I don't think it's the first time in American history where Jews have aligned themselves with right-wingers, some of whom are anti-Semitic. I think there's some precedent for this in Poland, for instance. So I don't know what they tell themselves at night. They probably just say that it's not as bad as it seems, and Trump's getting a raw deal. And yeah, there are a few unsavory characters, but the alternative's worse. That's probably what they say.
Okay, there's lots of interesting questions here. Let's see. Is Jewish socialism in the early 1920s the product of their particular social position, proletarianized in the Pale of Settlement, and suspected by nationalists in Central and Western Europe? Does their position now militate against a recrudescence of a socialist movement sparked by the Jews?
Okay. It sounds like an historian wrote that.
Yes. I like the recrudescence.
There you go. Wonderful word. So was socialism a product of social class among Jews? Partially, yes. There was a fairly rapid proletarianization of Eastern European Jews and immigrants to the United States, meaning that a large number of Jews who worked as craftsmen found themselves working for wages in factories by 1900. And almost overnight, the immigrants who came to the United States, regardless of what their social background was, were working in factories immediately from the moment they stepped foot. So that in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, there is a massive Jewish proletariat that sprung up really almost overnight. That, of course, established the social conditions for a working class socialist movement. Without that, it couldn't have happened. It's a crucial precondition. But it's not the only one, because if that were the only factor, then we'd see America would have been, there might have been a socialist revolution by now if proletarianization was the key to political radicalization. In fact, it often did not happen that way. Only certain immigrant groups gravitated to the political left, and Jews were one of them. Finns were another. German Americans were another group at different times. So Irish Americans, on the other hand, did not, by and large. So there had to have been other factors. And the other factors, just to rattle them off quickly, I would say we're talking about a young immigration. Young people, I think, were more open to change and ideas. Structures of authority had collapsed or non-existent in Jewish family and communal life. Rabbis had almost no sway or status to speak of during the immigrant period. Many did not come to the United States, but radical intellectuals, educated people who had been revolutionaries in Russia, came here by the thousands and threw themselves into the mobilization of the Jewish working class, and they did it unimpeded, unlike, say, in Catholic communities where there was a strong church hierarchy that was anti-socialist. That didn't exist in the United States. It's kind of a leadership vacuum that the left filled. I would say these things and more, Jews, by moving to New York, put themselves in close contact with socialists, specifically German socialists on the Lower East Side, which was filled with German socialists when Jews started arriving. So their Americanization process was to some degree inflected through a previous immigrant group, Germans, who built a really large socialism. In fact, they brought over Marxism to the United States. Germans were really the conduits of Marxism in the United States in the 19th century, and they were the neighbors of Jews for a couple decades in the late 19th century. These are some of the reasons why Jews leaned so far to the left in the late 19th and into the early mid 20th century. They're not all the reasons, but I would say those are. So it's not just social class. There's an array of sociological factors that played into this. The future. The future is, I don't know if there's a future for socialism in this country or not. I do think, if I were to make a prediction about Jews and the left, I'd say one thing regarding social class is I believe we are just starting to witness downward mobility in the Jewish community, possibly for the first time in American history. This is in part based on my observations. It's in part based on the Pew Charitable Trust study of Jews, which I think is now 5 years old. One of the least noticed parts of that study, most people paid attention to levels of religious observance among young Jews, attachment or lack thereof to Israel. But to me, I think what was the most potentially important was the decline in income among younger Jews. I think to some degree this is blunted by the fact that a fair number of Jews are benefiting from inherited wealth. But if the American class structure is polarizing, if the middle class is eroding, there's no reason to think Jews won't be affected by that, in my opinion. And I think the Pew Trust identified signs of this. And I think this is, in my view, this is the great under-recognized factor in Jewish life today. Whether that points to socialism, if it doesn't do that with Jews, I don't know who it will. In other words, because of Jewish education levels, political legacies, generally liberal sympathies, I would predict that young Jews experiencing downward mobility will continue to lean leftward in some way. Whether that's articulated through socialism or not, I don't know, but there is a resurgence of socialism among young, educated people who lean to the left.
Yeah. Albeit a very different kind.
Very different kind.
Of socialism.
Absolutely. From the earlier era, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, so I have two related questions. Fundamentally, Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman, where do they fit in to your story and fundamentally the narrative of women in radical Jewish politics?
Okay.
Where do they stand? What can you have to say about this?
Okay, so I already said a few words about Luxemburg, so let me say a few words about Emma Goldman, who was, in my view, a heroic figure in not only American Jewish history, but US history more generally. Emma Goldman, so again, a kind of typical immigrant figure in certain ways. She came in the 1880s with members of her family. She was proletarianized. She worked in, I can't remember what her first job was, but experienced that, moved to the Lower East Side, and she discovered anarchism. Like so many other Jews, right, who were not radicals in Russia, but came to the United States and discovered it. She did, and did it through the German immigrants that I was referring to. She's very close, very, very close personally with German anarchists, and she became an anarchist. And she represents in her this kind of non-Jewish Jew type. She adamantly refused to embrace nationalism. Now, the twist, the difference between her and Emma Goldman, the difference between Emma Goldman and Luxemburg is Luxemburg didn't know Yiddish, didn't want to know Yiddish, didn't want to know people who knew Yiddish, but Emma Goldman lectured in Yiddish and wrote in Yiddish all the time. She threw herself into the public life of the immigrant Jewish masses in really starting in the 1880s until she was deported from the United States in 1919 for her anti-war position. So she was something you saw in New York a lot, or elsewhere in America, which is the internationalist who operates mostly in Yiddish, or at least for a while. She then moved to English and was moved into the bohemian life of left-wing Greenwich Village, but she never left the Jewish community behind. She always spoke Yiddish when needed. And again, this is someone who kind of defies the categories, at least the categories as they existed in Europe. Again, Jews were her people, and Yiddish was the language she knew it perfectly well and used it all the time. And she was part of, again, a more cosmopolitan atmosphere, and then she was expelled from the United States for her anti-war activity. She went to Russia. She first was pro-Bolshevik with criticisms. She's not a Marxist. As an anarchist, she opposed it, but she still thought Bolshevism was good at the beginning. Then she turned, she saw it as authoritarian, and she lived a fairly unhappy life. She was never let back into the United States. The final thing I'd say about this, it doesn't deal with Jews directly, but that is that she helped spearhead a movement in the United States and internationally on behalf of Soviet political prisoners in the 1920s. Anarchists, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, all these types were being thrown into prison by the Bolsheviks at a very early point. And Emma Goldman and her cohorts, most of them were Jews, it just so happened, or maybe that's not an accident, but in any case, they took up this cause of political prisoners, and it was really Jews in the United States, anarchists and others, who carried that torch of a libertarian notion of socialism when it was very unpopular because America was conservative on the one hand and the communists didn't adhere to it on the other hand. And that was Emma Goldman. So she never adhered to Jewish nationalism. She wouldn't sign on to that, but she was Jewish in the ways I'm describing and also sensitive to anti-Semitism. She wasn't indifferent to it. She just was one of these people who said, I'm Jewish, I'm not ashamed of it. I live in a Jewish milieu, partially, but it's not my politics. It's not the basis of my politics. Of course, most of America saw her as a fiery Jewish woman. The second question was, what about Jewish women? And one of the important things about the socialist movement in this country is it provided an avenue for women to assert themselves in public, not just as mothers, which they did very well in the private sphere, they asserted themselves quite well, but in the public sphere as union activists, as revolutionaries, as propagandists. Now, most of them didn't rise as high as Emma Goldman. She was particularly talented and particularly forceful and ambitious, and she didn't get married and didn't have children, so she was able to do this. But if you looked in the lower levels and the mid-levels of Jewish labor, working class life, there were dozens and dozens of women who many will never know of. They led strikes and then they disappeared. Or some stayed in the movement the rest of their lives. It's a mix, but that's a history that still deserves to be really written in full. But you can't understand what the socialist movement meant to Jews without understanding the role women played in it.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is another connection for these sorts of global conversations, right? We see that dynamic so frequently. I mean, Emma Goldman is more of an example, an outlier perhaps among all of these, but so many times we see Jewish women who are involved in a sort of familial setting, that some member of their family is involved in the Communist Party, and they are in turn involved in the Communist Party. And one of the most tragic people that I've interviewed, I mean, not tragic, but a tragic thing, and how women's voices end up becoming more frequently occluded in this history is the case of this woman who was married to one of the primary communists I talk about, and I said, and she gave me access to his papers and all of these things, and I said, well, you know, what about you? Tell me about your time growing up with all of this. She'd grown up on the docks of Casablanca when all of this was happening with all the workers and the growth of labor movement. She said, I don't have anything important to say. You know, I have nothing interesting to say about this. And then proceeded to tell me about the time that her husband was tossed in jail for 8 days, tortured by the government, and then the Soviet Union paid for them all to take a vacation in the Crimea. So it just goes to show, you know, this lack of women's stories. I mean, you would never find her voice on the record. Right, in any of the archival documents, but it's full of these sorts of things.
I will say one qualification to this issue of silence and the lack of women's voices, and that is Jews generally, and Jewish women in particular, did leave written records of their experiences compared to other Americans. And someone actually studied this, an oral historian, someone who specialized in oral history, worked on a whole project on the oral history of workers in New York, and she interviewed a lot of Italian garment workers and a lot of Jewish garment workers, and she wrote an article about this because she said the Italian men and women actually were very reluctant to talk about their lives, period, and when they did, it was always private. You know, Gino was a good card player or something like that. You know, they talked about family and neighborhood. But she said that Jewish men and women put their lives in an historical framework. They were eager to talk when asked, and then they just put their lives in a historical framework. And that is, I believe, I'm speaking for the scholar, I believe it was because of the influence of socialism. That socialism gave people a framework for understanding their personal lives in world historical terms. You know, that was the genius of it. It said, you're not just a worker, you're a maker of history. And I think, I think there's an ethnic and political, ethno-political convergence that enabled Jews to tell their stories, including women, but women didn't have as many opportunities as men. I'd say that was the difference.
Yeah. Well, speaking about Jewishness and Marxism and this very fundamental level, sort of the blurred lines of particularism as a Jew or as a member of a certain nation state or a commitment to internationalism. I wonder if you could reflect on Marx actually a little bit more. And Marx is so often taken up as this ideological standard bearer and treated almost as if he's in an ahistorical vacuum, as if he's some sort of gospel, when in fact he is a historical figure with a Jewish background who wrote on the Jewish question, right, several years before the Communist, not several, 4 years before the Communist Manifesto, and talking about this intrinsic Jewishness, its relationship to capitalism, and what the coming historical place of Jews should be.
Well, I think Marx, when it comes to Jews, is somewhat ambiguous. On the one hand, he writes on the Jewish question, which is an argument in favor of emancipation of the Jews, actually. But that can be missed because it's filled with anti-Semitic verbiage about Jews and capitalism, which is highly unfortunate. Not unusual for the time, but highly unfortunate. I think if you take all those references out of that essay to Jews and capitalism and so forth, the argument doesn't change one bit. The argument was that, of course, he's arguing against someone who opposed the emancipation of Jews. And the argument was, of course, Jews should be emancipated. That goes without saying. Well, it has to be said, but there's more to be said. And he said the big part of the argument was that by giving emancipation to Jews, it doesn't eliminate oppression and exploitation, and that's because capitalism remains in place. And he used anti-Semitic imagery to describe capitalism. Again, that's the unfortunate part of it. But the essay is one in favor of emancipation of Jews under a liberal democratic regime, and arguing that's insufficient. Now, that's the ambiguous side of it. The less ambiguous side of, I think, Marx's legacy for Jews is that he presented a critique of capitalism that was, certainly in his mature years, entirely free of anti-Semitism, and provided an analysis to his later followers that enabled them to understand capitalism free of anti-Semitism. That wasn't always true of non-Marxists, socialists and anarchists in Russia and some other places. They were sometimes really vicious anti-Semites in certain instances, certain prominent instances. But Marxism really was free of anti-Semitism by the time it became a mass movement. Not to say you couldn't find individuals who had negative perceptions of Jews. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the movement itself was not an anti-Semitic movement. It's actually a movement that the socialist movement, the Marxian socialist movement, defended Jews, attacked anti-Semitism, and again, I think crucially, provided a critique of capitalism devoid of anti-Semitism that did not see Jews as bearers of capitalism in any kind of negative or pernicious way.
Well, related to that then, why did the Soviet leadership target Jewish communists?
Okay, let's take this again back to Trotsky. All roads lead back to Trotsky tonight. So the Soviet regime under Stalin begins using anti-Semitism in the battle against, in the factional struggles against Trotsky. So what I mean is Trotsky and some of his followers who were Jews all of a sudden started seeing their names in print with their original Jewish names. Stopped seeing Trotsky but Bronstein, right? Things like that, right? That was a way of Stalin and his supporters of saying to the party bureaucracy and the public, see these guys, they're wrong, they're worse than wrong, they're harmful to the Soviet Union, and they're Jews. Right? That's what Stalin was doing in the 1920s, and so that's one reason. It was part of a factional struggle in the 1920s. Beyond that, I don't know if I can say. I mean, I can. I'm hesitant to speak. There's a Soviet historian who was my professor in the spring of 1989. I don't know if I want to say anything. I probably, I'm just going to leave it at that.
All right.
I can't say any more with any confidence.
Okay, so we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. There are so many, so
Okay.
I'm going to be sure to hand you this stack of really interesting questions at the end of all this. But there are several questions here that ask you to reflect a bit more about Judaism and socialism and a connection, the sort of fluidity that you described, right, about some figures saying, well, no, this Jewishness is not mutually exclusive with socialism, not mutually exclusive with this sort of political engagement, and then on the flip side, others who would like to see Jewishness as secondary to a more universalist understanding of humanity as the emancipated or true human. So there are several questions asking about, say, the concept of tikkun olam, or repairing the world, as that relates to Jewish socialism. And what about, perhaps, within Judaism would relate to socialism, how that might have gone institutionally. And then on the flip side of both of those religious questions, there's another one that asks, how did the right's ability to define communism or to conflate communism and socialism, for instance, also allow them to define Jewishness? So both a question about interior definition of Jewishness and compatibility with radical politics, as well as an outside imposition of that identity, defining both Jewishness as well as communism, the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that you were talking about earlier.
All right, there's a lot there.
That's what happens when I'm told there are like 2 questions left. I'm like, well, in that case, I'll sneak in 5 into 2. So.
I'll try to parse them. All right, so as far as individual Jews went, there were plenty of Jews in the United States during this heyday, the immigrant heyday, and even beyond, into, I'd say, the 30s and 40s. There were plenty of religious Jews. I hesitate to use the word Orthodox, because Orthodox can have misleading connotations of people who are really rigid and doctrinaire. And at the time, 100 years ago, very few people in the United States who attended Orthodox shuls and kept kosher were rigid in the way Orthodoxy now seems. Most religious Jews in the U.S. at that time were really flexible in lots of ways, in their beliefs, in their practice, but still saw themselves as traditional Jews. In that being the case, a good number of them saw themselves as either socialists or perfectly willing to join a socialist union or vote for the Socialist Party candidate. One reason why we know this, it's not the only reason, but one is that the great Yiddish newspaper, The Forward, had a whole symposium on this. In the symposium was this question: can you be religious and a socialist? And most of the people who wrote in said, yes, I am religious. I go to shul and I consider myself a socialist. So things were very fluid then, and so people had various Jews had different identity. There were the theoreticians, and then there was sort of the everyday Jews who absorbed different ideas, and their lives were not always consistent with any theory, but they to the question, they were both socialists and Jews on some, religious Jews on some level. Now, was religion a causal factor, which I think was another question? Was it a causal factor behind the disproportionate number of Jews who turned leftward in the era we're talking about? And I don't think it is. Or at least I've been very reluctant over the years to rely on religion as a factor. I think the kind of social factors I discussed earlier were much more important. At the same time, I have to admit that it's impossible for people to come from traditional societies, even traditional societies in decay, as Russian Jewish and Eastern European Jewish society was in the late 19th century, and not bring cultural baggage with them. It would just be impossible to imagine that. So what I think is pertinent, not tikkun olam, which was a concept virtually no one knew of at the time. It's a fairly arcane mystical notion in Judaism that most Jews didn't know. One reason why I know this is, first of all, no one ever used it. The one example I found, and I'm just going to say this because now it's invoked as a tradition. It was never a tradition. And one example I stumbled upon was written by a former yeshiva student from Warsaw who turned into an adamant atheist and Marxist, very well known in the United States. He's a very popular journalist and beloved speaker. And I just bumped into an article he wrote in the 1920s about tikkun olam. And it was clear he did not expect his readers to know the concept. He explained it to them and then denounced it. Because he did not see it as a source of social justice and idealism.
Break the world was the...
Well, his view is that this is offering Jews pie in the sky. This is saying to them, don't struggle for social justice now. Repairing the world in some abstract way will come with heaven. Blah blah. He said, stay away from this idea that you've never heard of. Was basically the thrust of the article. So that plays no role in anything at that time. But there were notions of social justice. Every community, every religion, every culture has to have those. So there were notions of social justice. There was the ethical tradition of the prophets. And I would say, it sounds so cliche, I'm hesitant to say it, but I've come to think it's real. It was real, and that is messianism. I do think the messianic strain in Judaism was activated by socialism. I don't know if it caused it. Actually, I don't think it was causal in a primary way, or not even in a secondary way, but maybe in a tertiary way. There was a kind of, I think messianism what was, if not a causal factor, then part of the, let's call it the psychology and culture of Jewish life at the turn of the century, at a time of real turmoil. Social turmoil, of rupture caused by the immigrant experience, of the hopes raised by the 1905 revolution, the 1917 revolution, the pogroms. These are cataclysms. And I think there was something of that something of a messianism that bubbled up during that time period. So I think that's probably pertinent. But without all the social factors I tried to enunciate, I don't think Judaism would have caused any kind of radicalism. One reason why we know this is that the geographic variations in socialism was not popular among all Jews everywhere, right? It's popular among some Jews to a greater or lesser degree in certain countries. And Orthodox Jews were not the most radical. They were the least radical, despite what I said earlier about some Jews who were religious and embraced socialism. But it was Jews who were breaking from religion that were really the driving force behind the left, not those Jews who were most religious. So religion in and of itself cannot be a causal factor. If religion was primary, then the most devout Jews would have been the most politically radical. And again, this would have been, you'd expect this to be evenly distributed across time and place. And so I don't think you can dismiss it at all. I think it's actually religion was quite important, but not, as I say, causal or fundamental.
Yeah, so I'll permit one more question,
sure.
because I think it's a nice rounding out from what you were just describing.
I can go on all night.
I know. I mean, there's so many interesting things to unpack with this, and this is related to a question I had earlier as well, this last question, involving the notion of the Soviet Union as a sort of savior that you touched on in 1917, but then I wanted to juxtapose that with 1948. Mm-hmm. And then even before then, during the Second World War as well, these sorts of moments where the Soviet Union can be narrativized in a sort of salvation manner, 1948 being a little bit fraught for first supporting the establishment of the State of Israel, then later backtracking on this. So if you could reflect a little bit about that salvation narrative, and as that sort of pendulum or fluidity maybe hardens between radicalisms and Zionism in the middle of the 20th century.
This is important. I think you're touching on something very important in the history of Jews and radicalism, is the Soviet Union's shifting actions regarding Jews. So what makes, I think, the communist experience, or the history of Jews and socialism more generally, very fraught, is something I touched on before. The stakes were very high for Jews in the revolution and how it was going to play out. And it was so fraught because, as I stressed, there was a life and death aspect to it. Right? So if you were a liberal school teacher in the 20s, if you were a feminist in America in the 20s, if you were a black nationalist in the 20s, the Soviet Union had symbolic importance, right? But it didn't have immediate concrete importance to their lives, right? Because they weren't connected to Russia in the way Jews were. So that's always important to understand in trying to figure out the relationship of Jews to communism. So at certain points in time, the Soviet Union is, really the savior of Jews in the most basic way. That was true in the Russian Civil War between 1918 and 1920, as I touched on before. That's also true in World War II, as you just alluded to. When again the Red Army is responsible for saving the lives of many, many Jews. It's a bulwark against Nazism. Certainly seen that way. And then in 1948, the Soviet Union comes out in favor of the establishment of the State of Israel, and at a time when the United States really didn't. The United States waffled for a long time and anyway had an arms embargo on the Middle East. And the Soviet Union, on the other hand, comes out first and very staunchly in favor of the partition of Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish and Arab state side by side. And on top of it, not only does it help push it through in the UN, Communist Czechoslovakia arms Israel with heavy weapons. There were weapons smuggled in from the United States and elsewhere, but heavy weaponry came from Czechoslovakia. So that the Soviet Union comes out on the side of Zionism, which the Soviet Union had been attacking since before the Soviet Union. So in these crucial moments, the Civil War, World War II, and 47, 48, the Soviet Union not only takes a position that coincides with what most Jews see as their interests, living, surviving. Well, that was just it. It wasn't just a favorable position on something. These were life and death moments. And so not only if you were a communist, of course if you're a communist, this is proof of what the Soviet Union means for Jews, but even if you were not, there's a wide array of Jews, liberals, Orthodox Jews at Yeshiva University, Yiddishists, various kinds of people who said the Soviet Union, we might criticize it in some ways, but the Soviet Union is a friend of the Jewish people and doing it in its own way through communism and so forth. Now, one of the reasons why this is so fraught is because the flip side of it is that the Soviet Union seems to be the enemy of the Jewish people at certain points of time. When the Soviet Yiddish writers are murdered, for instance, right? You can imagine you probably are familiar with the reaction. So when anti-Semitism is stirred up or used as part of state policy in the late Stalin period, right? That's an example. When the Soviet Union turns against Israel by the early 1950s, that's another example of this really what is for most Jews in the Communist Party and beyond very painful. You know, it's this back and forth dynamic. The Soviet Union's our savior. No, it's our enemy. No, it's our savior. No, it's our, and that made for a very fraught relationship.
Especially for Jews in North Africa and the Middle East. It was a total
I imagine it was
betrayal in this sense. But yeah.
Right. Well, what betrayal means actually could have shifted.
Exactly.
For Jewish leftists in North, what's the betrayal? In North Africa, it might have been quite different for let's say, communists in the Moroccan Communist Party, perhaps, when the Soviet Union adopted a pro-Zionist position. That's a betrayal. In the United States, that's not seen as a betrayal. That's seen as, Soviet Union taking the right position by most Jewish communists. So this is why, again, the relationship of Jews to communism, maybe socialism more generally, is highly fraught. It's not a linear story. It's not one that's filled with only with glorious achievements. It's one that's filled with aspirations and hope and then terrible disappointments. And these are the Jewish component of the story, not just the socialist component. Right. The Jewish component interlaced with the general socialist story of Russia and revolutions elsewhere makes it both intimately part of Jewish history, of Jewish experience, Jewish politics, and one that's painful at the same time.
Yeah, well, that seems like a great, painful, and wonderful, sublime note
to end on.
It's not always painful.
It's not always painful. It's just part of it.
A fluid, complex note to end on, a full-bodied note to end on. So thank you so much, Toni, for joining us.
Thank you.